Okay, good. Well, welcome everyone to the first day of the 2021 McCain Conference. I'm Ed Barrett, Research Director of the Naval Academy's Stockdale Center for Ethical Leadership. Each year, this conference assembles faculty and midshipmen to examine timely ethics topics relevant to military operations. And this week, we'll delve into the ethically perilous world of spying. Although thought about the justice of warfare is highly developed, ethical analyses of intelligence operations, which can involve lying, manipulation, coercion, stealing, and even killing, are relatively recent and conflicting, as we were just discussing. So our goal this week is to identify the relevant ethical principles and then apply them to specific activities, including human and technical intelligence gathering, interrogational torture, covert action, and intelligence analysis. So to begin this endeavor, we're honored to have Michael Morell, the former deputy and acting director of the Central Intelligence Agency. He's also the author of The Great War of Our Time, the CIA's fight against terrorism from Al-Qa'ida to ISIS. Michael will have a discussion with Mitt Regan, professor at Georgetown Law and senior fellow at the Stockdale Center, and will then take questions from the audience. And to the audience, please send questions as they occur to you during the discussion via the chat function. And for midshipmen, please preface your questions with MIDN so I can address your issues first. So Michael, thank you for joining us today, and I cede the floor to Mitt Regan.
Thank you. Dr. Thomas, did you want to say a few words as well, just to introduce the event?
Well, again, I'll just say thanks to Mr. Morell, Mike, for joining us. No better way to kick off the McCain Conference than to have his level of insight and expertise on this, as Dr. Barrett mentioned, very vexing, challenging topic. So, Mitt, I commit him to your very capable hands, and I'm very glad that you are facilitating this first conversation.
Well, thank you very much, Michael. I'll just echo that it's a great privilege to have you here, someone with such a distinguished career in the intelligence community, someone who also, some of you may know, was in fact in charge of the presidential daily brief of intelligence matters and was with President Bush on 9/11. Michael, let me start with a basic threshold question that some people ask me. Does it even make sense to talk about ethics in the context of intelligence activities? In your book on your career in the CIA, you describe the agency as an organization that conducts espionage as a business, stealing secrets around the globe. A former colleague in the UK, David Ullman, who is head of GCHQ, the UK Signals Intelligence Agency, said, to overcome the determination of the person with the secret to keep can require the use of ethically questionable methods, intruding on personal communications, breaking into homes to plant bugs, hacking networks, persuading others to betray their oaths of loyalty to their state or inform on their colleagues. But if this weren't done, the real secrets of value to the nation would not be obtained. So all this, of course, is done in pursuit of the mission of protecting the country. So it would seem pretty easy simply to adopt the philosophy that the ends justify the means. Now, I know you don't think that's the case, but why not?
Yeah, so look, I think that everything you just said, Mitt, you could say about the military, right? You could say about killing other human beings, right? As part of a military operation, and yet we all know that there are ethics involved there. You guys know them better than I do, but there are also ethics involved in intelligence operations and intelligence analysis, and there needs to be. And the reason there needs to be is because we are representing the American people. We're representing the U.S. government, and we don't just take an oath to the Constitution. We actually think about furthering the values of the nation. Whether that be freedom or democracy or what have you. So I don't think it's possible to represent the nation, to do the nation's work without upholding the values of the nation. So does imposing ethical limits get in the way of intelligence operations? Sure. But I don't think we could sustain intelligence operations, sustain intelligence capabilities without living within our values. And I think that's why it's so important.
And how are those actually operationalized with respect to intelligence operations and intelligence activities? That is, what kinds of limits based on those values does the agency and the intelligence community believe are important?
Yeah. So, it starts with the people we hire. My last year, there were 180,000 applications for 1,000 jobs. So we really get our choice of America's best and brightest. And part of that is not only choosing talented people, right? But people who have the right values, people who we believe that we can trust, right? And therefore people who the Congress can trust, and by extension, the American people. So it starts with who we hire. Quite frankly, the polygraph is pretty useful in identifying people who might not have those values. It continues sort of on day one when you take the oath of office, which I used to give the new officers. But then I would talk about more than just defending the Constitution. I would talk about what our job is, which is collecting information that others are trying to keep secret from us, and why that's important, and then analyzing that, and then I would talk about how we expect officers to behave and to conduct themselves, and then those same kind of values and ethics and tenets got reinforced in the introductory courses. And then I'd say most importantly, they get reinforced day to day on the job in terms of what decisions are made and what decisions aren't made. So let me give you an example. When I was Leon Panetta's deputy, Leon and I and another senior officer from the agency had a meeting with Susan Rice, who was then the ambassador to the United Nations. And in this meeting, this senior officer of the agency intentionally said something to Ambassador Rice that wasn't accurate. And Leon didn't know it at the time, but on the way back in the car, the three of us were talking about it, and I pointed this out to the director in front of this officer. And he didn't say anything at the time, but we came back to the agency and he asked both of us to come into his office. And we sat down around his table and he said to this senior officer, is what Michael said in the car true? That you knew that what you said was not accurate. And this officer said yes. And Leon said, all right, that is strike one. And this is not baseball. You have one more shot. And if you do this again, you're gone. So that story spread like wildfire across the agency, right? And it's those kind of actions and decisions that reinforce what you're told, on day one, and what you learn in these classes.
Okay. I know the intelligence community adopted a set of ethical principles, I believe under D&I Director Clapper. at the time. But on an ongoing basis, what kinds of things does the agency do to make sure that its employees understand how to apply those? Well, let's say on the operations side, with trying to cultivate human intelligence, for instance, right? Or any other kinds of activities that the agency might conduct, right? I mean, as we know, where the rubber meets the road in ethics is in particular situations when people often don't have someone looking over their shoulder, right? And they have to use judgment, right? Are there things on an ongoing basis that the agency tries to do to ensure that people do act according to those ethical principles?
Sure. The first thing I'd say though is, and I think this is important, right? Is the very act of recruiting another human being to spy for the United States, right? The very act of asking them to commit espionage against their own country, right? To violate the law of their own country, to violate their own principles and ethics as they relate to their own country, right? You would think that that's a kind of ethically blurry space, right? But I think it's not. And I think it's not because the most important ethic we have is that the search for the truth is the most important thing we do, right? And we have, excuse me, there's guys outside working. Don't be long. We have people, we have adversaries who are developing capabilities and have intentions and plans that would harm the United States, and they're trying to keep that secret from us, right? And in order to protect ourselves, we need to find out what those secrets are. So that imperative, right, I think overcomes the very notion, right, of taking advantage of another human being when you ask them and get them to say yes to spying for you. And you are taking advantage of their vulnerabilities, right? In fact, when you're interacting with these people, you're trying to identify their vulnerabilities. What's a vulnerability? Somebody needs money. Somebody has significant debts. Somebody wants their kids to go to college in the United States. It's a vulnerability. Somebody has a wife who has a health issue and needs medical care in the West. That's a vulnerability, right? And so we take advantage of those. What I think, though, is important is that there's a limit to that. And the limit to it is that, I know we're going to come back to this, but the limit to that is we only use positive inducements. So we say, we'll give you money if you work for us. We'll take care of your wife's health care if you work for us. We'll make sure your kids get into the right schools if you work for us, right? If you work for us for a certain period of time, you can come to the United States. We do not use negative inducements. We do not use coercion. We do not use blackmail. It's in the past, in the far past of the agency, we did, but we've grown a lot since then, in many, many ways, including ethically. So those are things that are today off the table. And then there's a whole set of rules that are actually written down on paper about two things, right? Who we pretend to be when we're first interacting with people. So what is our cover, right? Are we a State Department officer, or are we a military officer, or, right? And there's certain things that are written on a piece of paper that we are not allowed to pretend to be. So somebody serving in the Peace Corps, a journalist, a medical professional, somebody of religious order, because we think that's not the right thing to do, and would put those people, right, at risk. And then there are also rules with regard to who we can recruit. So there are certain categories of people who we cannot go after for similar reasons, right? And those are all documented. And then the last thing I'd say is CIA operations officers are not out on the streets acting on their own. They're not out there making decisions on their own. So before you have any interaction with somebody that you're interested in, there is a pretty, and I don't want to discourage anybody from someday being interested in being an operations officer, but there's a pretty bureaucratic process that you go through, right, for putting together a plan for how you're going to meet this person, what your conversation is going to be, what are the different possible ways that conversation can go, and what are your responses to their responses, et cetera, right? So all that has to be approved by the station chief, wherever you are serving. And then in most cases, that comes back to Washington to be approved. And then when you're done, right, you have to write up a report on exactly what happened. And you have to brief your chief of station on it, right? So this is not folks out there acting on their own. There's very, very close supervision here because of the consequences of getting caught, because of the consequences of doing something wrong.
So if we move to another area, of activity, what's sometimes called political action, we know it's common knowledge countries attempt to influence events in other countries. Sometimes that takes the form of providing assistance to groups that may oppose a regime, whether it's, assistance to, in the 1980s, for instance, assistance to Solidarity in Poland, perhaps assistance to the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, assistance to the Contras in opposing the Nicaraguan government, right? So some of those have been controversial, others less so, but what kinds of ethical principles should guide U.S. efforts to influence the political dynamics in other countries?
Yeah, so I am so glad you asked this question. So we are now talking about what you know to be covert action. And the question that you're asking is a policy question. It's not an intelligence question. The decision to undertake a covert action, to include the specific activities that CIA will undertake on behalf of the United States, is a policy decision. That decision is made by the president in writing, with the advice and counsel of his or her national security team. So it's a policy question about what the ethics of covert action are. I think the interesting intelligence question is the way this works, right, is the White House comes to the CIA and it says, I'm trying to achieve this policy objective, this particular policy objective. I'm going to make this up. I'm trying to slow down the Iranian nuclear program. They're pursuing a nuclear weapon and I want to do anything I can to slow it down. What can you do for me? And so those ideas are often generated at the agency. Sometimes they're generated in policy circles, but they're often generated at the agency. And they're brought back to the policymakers for discussion. And so the real intelligence question is, as a senior officer at CIA, do you take every legal option that you think would be effective back to the president, or do you only take the ones that you're morally comfortable with yourself? That is a really interesting question, right? Do you get to be the decider of the options that go in front of the president? Or do you take all the options forward? My own person, and I think different directors would answer that question differently. I think, in fact, I know that Mike Hayden would say, it's my responsibility to take to the president any option that is legal that I think would be effective. It's for the president to decide. My view is a little bit different. My view is that my morals and my ethics matter here. It's my organization. I'm in charge. I have to lead. I have to have the respect of my officers in order to lead. And so I'm going to make some decisions about what I take forward and what I don't. But that's the interesting question. And I would just finish up here. There's a tremendous amount of controversy about enhanced interrogation techniques, right, done by the Bush administration in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. And I do a lot of talks like this around the country, and I always get asked about it. And to drive home the point that we've just talked about, that what you do in covert action is a policy decision and not an intelligence decision, I will always say, look, I will talk to you about this for as long as you want. We can go on for hours in talking about this in every detail. If you accept one proposition, if you accept the proposition that this was not CIA's program, it was directed by the president, approved by his national security team, approved by the attorney general, multiple attorney generals on multiple occasions, and briefed to Congress with their support. So as long as we agree this is America's program and not CIA's, let's have a conversation about it.
Well, let me follow up on that. John Brennan's recent memoirs, he was a deputy executive director at the agency at the time, and so got information about the enhanced interrogation program and went to then director George Tenet and basically said he was uneasy about it. And Tenet said, well, I want you to make sure that nothing's being done that hasn't been explicitly authorized by DOJ, Department of Justice. And Brennan said, that's the problem, George. We're not doing anything in violation, but I still have some concerns. And he says in his book, I'll just read a short quote, I've committed many sins of omission during my lifetime, but I consider my failure at the time to convey my concerns about the program in clear and unequivocal terms to George, other senior members, as my most egregious. In retrospect, do you think that those, such as he and perhaps others who had those kinds of concerns, should have been more forceful in raising them at the time?
Absolutely, right. In any profession, and in intelligence and military operations in particular, I think if you are uneasy morally about something that your organization is doing, that you have a responsibility to speak up. But I also want to add that the greatest responsibility is on the part of the leader in creating an environment where people feel comfortable raising issues like that. George actually, I was George's executive assistant, so I know him extraordinarily well, right? George created that kind of atmosphere. He created the kind of atmosphere where John felt comfortable coming into his office and saying that. Now, John admits that he should have gone even further. And so, an interesting question would then be, right, what if John had said, I just can't abide by this, right? This for me is morally reprehensible, right? Then I think, John's got to do what John thinks is right, in terms of whether he can continue to serve in that position. whether he can continue to serve at the agency. But I think the more interesting question is, what's George's responsibility if a senior officer comes to him and expresses deep concern about this, right? You know, George would tell you that he had already had a conversation with a number of people about the morality of this, right? And they knew they were on shaky ground, including with Condi Rice about the morality of this, right? But I do think that had John really expressed his concern, it would have been on George to share that concern with the White House. You know, I just want you to know that one of my most senior officers, in fact, one of the ones that I respect the most, is deeply uneasy about this. And I just need to share that with you. So I do think it's the responsibility of officers to speak up. I do think it's responsibility of leaders to create the environment for them to speak up, but I think it's also the responsibility of leaders then to share that up the chain of command.
Okay. And then just, sort of stepping back from that program with the benefit of some years of hindsight, it was obviously, it's been a tremendous flashpoint for the agency. Are stepping back now, as you look at it, are there lessons learned from that program that are valuable for the agency and the intelligence community in going forward?
Absolutely. There are many lessons. The first one, and maybe the most important one, is when we were approached and asked to be the nation's jailers of terrorists, we should have said no. We're not in that business. This was a decision that Secretary Rumsfeld made. That he didn't want to be in that business. Eventually, he got into that business, at Guantanamo and some other places, but he didn't want to be. We should have said no. And when we were asked to do interrogations, we should have said no. We don't know anything about that, right? We're not trained interrogators. So when we started this, we had no idea what we were doing. Literally, no idea what we were doing. From either being from the concept of running a prison to the concept of conducting interrogations, no idea, no training, no background, no experience, no history. Look, one of the mistakes that I've seen made over and over and over again by CIA is that it's too quick to say yes to covert action. Presidents turn too quickly to CIA for help when they have a really sticky foreign policy problem. And the agency is too quick to say yes. And I think the agency, because it wants to be helpful, right? It wants to help the president achieve his objectives. But I think the agency really needs to think about whether what it can do can really be effective in moving the policy needle, and whether what it's being asked to do, what impact that will have long-term on the agency in terms of its capabilities and in terms of its reputation. I tried, when I was acting director, there were a couple of requests from the Obama administration for us to think about covert action with regard to areas where we had never done it before. And my answer to Dennis McDonough and to Tom Donilon was, we can't help you, right? We could put together a program that costs, $200 million and we could do a bunch of stuff, but it's not going to move the policy needle for you. It's just not. It's going to make you feel good, but it's not going to move the needle. So no, we don't think this is a good idea.
One of the concepts that's arisen and become more prominent in recent years in thinking about military ethics, and particularly those who have served in combat, is this concept of moral injury. which is just sort of the sense, I'll paraphrase it, of disillusionment and the value of any kind of moral principles at all. I mean, some of the figures, perhaps in some of the John le Carre novels, might be said to be suffering from moral injury, right?
Yeah.
Is that a risk given the kind of work that the agency does? And to the extent it is, does the agency try to be alert to that and take steps to try to intervene?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. It's a great question. So here you have, in this intelligence business, you have intelligence officers who are authorized to break the laws of other countries. Not our own laws, right, mind you, but the laws of other countries. And what impact does that have on them and their willingness to, right, and their own morality and their willingness to act in accordance with the standards that we set? Look, we have our share of operations officers who get themselves into trouble, in a variety of different ways, like many organizations. But it is interesting to me that, we never did a study on this, probably should have. It's interesting that operations officers seem to get themselves into more trouble than other officers at the agency, analysts, support officers, scientists and engineers, etc. In fact, I'd say, for a group of people that account for maybe 20% of the organization, they seem to have 80% of the problems. So maybe this is exactly what you're talking about. And we didn't have, we had programs in place to make it difficult for people to do the wrong thing, right? When you pay an asset, when you pay a spy money, you actually get them to sign a receipt. Why? To make sure that the operations officer, isn't paying the asset less than the organization thinks it's paying and pocketing the rest, right? That's why you do it. And so there's all these auditing trails and all sorts of things that any compliance officer in any large organization would recognize. But do we pay attention to this from a psychological perspective, and look out for it from a human resources care perspective? No, but your question suggests to me that we should.
Interesting. I mean, but it's not hard to imagine why those in operations might be particularly prone to that. You spent most of your career on the analysis side. In what ways could that arise for analysts, as well as those in operations?
So the sin on the analytic side of the agency is something we call politicization, right? Which is somebody in the process, from the analyst all the way to the final consumer, changing the analysis in a way that is inconsistent with what the analysts really think. And it can happen at any part of that process, including the analysts themselves. So the risk the analysts themselves face is twofold. One is we're supposed to do analysis that is objective and is in no way impacted by politics or policy preferences. And so you're not supposed to think about what you think the right thing to do on a particular policy issue is if you're the analyst. But you know, if you are an analyst working on Afghanistan right now, right now, you can't help but have a policy view about what the right thing to do is. So you have to work very hard yourself, and your managers have to work very hard with you to make sure that your view of what the president should do about Afghanistan doesn't affect your analysis of the situation. So that's one way that analysts themselves can politicize, right? If they let their policy views impact their analysis. The other thing that analysts have to be careful of is not wanting to please somebody in the chain of command above them, right? And having an analyst think that I know what my boss wants to hear, or I know what the director wants to hear, or I know what the Secretary of State wants to hear, or I know what the president wants to hear, right? And therefore you tilt your analysis in that direction, right? That's the analyst also politicizing intelligence analysis. And so those are the two ways that analysts can mess up with regard to this extraordinarily important ethic in our business. There's a tremendous amount of training around this. There's a tremendous amount of conversation around it. There's an ombudsman that people can go to and say, hey, I think there's something funny here going on with the analysis, and the ombudsman can look into it. So, you know, are we perfect? No. But I think, right, we try very, very, very hard to make sure that that analysis is based on the facts and is objective in terms of being independent from politics and policy preferences.
I want to talk for a moment about something that might seem antithetical to intelligence activities, and that is transparency.
Yeah.
Right. You know, when Stella Remington took over as director of MI5, the British Domestic Security and Intelligence Agency, she sort of spearheaded an initiative to try to explain more to the public what MI5 was doing. Mark Pithian, who has co-written a book with David Oman, formerly of GCHQ, has said that, you know, secrecy is obviously essential in the intelligence community, but it also creates a potential, it does create a distance between the IC and citizens, which, you know, can then, you know, foster perhaps, you know, all sorts of ideas that, you know, the IC is part of the deep state, or the IC is doing a whole range of things, you know, that are problematic. I guess, do you think that it is important for the IC to be more sensitive to that? And if so, what steps could be taken in the direction of transparency while still, you know, protecting sources and methods?
Yeah. So obviously, right, obviously sources and methods have to be protected, because if you don't protect them, then you lose the ability to collect, right? So obviously they have to be protected. And, you know, having said that, the problem that you raise, right, is real. You know, there's got to be a way in a democratic society to give the American public a sense that these secret organizations who are operating in a democracy, right, are doing the job that they're supposed to be doing, are using the taxpayers' money, you know, wisely, and are acting consistent with the Constitution, with domestic law, and with our values, right? And how do you do that? Well, one of the ways you do that is through the system, right, that we've created in Congress with these oversight committees. But I'll be very honest with you, the oversight committees don't really do their job with regard to that, right? They're not out talking to the American people about what we're doing in those three areas I talked about, right? They're focused on other things. We can talk more about that if you want, but they're essentially not doing that job, whereas that's exactly what they're supposed to be doing on behalf of their colleagues in Congress and on behalf of the American people. And so I do think it does fall back on the leadership of the intelligence community to be as transparent as you can possibly be. And my own personal view is that we could be a lot more transparent. I think there is plenty of room to push out the fence line in terms of what we can talk about. And by pushing it out and explaining what we do and why we do it, and how well we do it, and talk about general successes and general failures. I think you can actually help educate the American people, make them feel more comfortable about these secret organizations and how they're operating. And I think you can actually, in the process, do a better job of protecting the secrets you have to protect.
Any example of a way in which the
I think I think the senior leadership has got to get out a lot. This has never been done to the level that I think it needs to be done. And in the Trump administration, the senior leadership of the IC went dark, right? They didn't want to be speak in public at all because they didn't want to upset their boss. So, I think Gina Haspel, in her 3 years as director, had 2 public appearances. 2 in 3 years. It should be 1 a week. Colleges, universities, think tanks, world affairs councils, civic groups. So I think the leadership has got to be out there and be seen. I think the leadership has to be open to talking to the media more than they do. There's something that Leon did that I thought was extraordinarily helpful, which was we would, once every 2 weeks or so, he and I would have an off-the-record dinner in his dining room at the agency with 6 or 7 reporters. And, we wouldn't tell them secrets, but we would show a lot of leg. And it was an attempt to, give them more insight into what we were doing so that the American people had a better understanding. I thought that was very important. And then the last thing I'll say is the declassification process, right? We're behind. We're woefully behind, right? So we need to do a better job on that. But and it's certainly important to put the documents out so that academics and reporters can go through them. But I'd like to find a way to bring into popular culture the declassified stories of the past. So if in fact, I'm thinking of suggesting this to Evrio, which is instead of putting out a 500-page study, when you declassify by a whole bunch of documents, right? Have one of your historians put out a 500-page study that very few people are going to read. Make a documentary and put it on YouTube, right? Just make sure it's accurate. No spinning, no, you got to do successes and failures, right? But make the history more accessible to the American people than it's made today.
Great, thank you. Well, Michael, I could happily continue for the rest of the afternoon, this conversation, but I won't. I want to close our segment by thanking you for your candor and your insight. And I'm going to turn it over now to Ed Barrett, who I think has been fielding questions from folks. So thank you so much again. It's a real pleasure to see you again.
Good to see you.
Well, thanks very much, Mitt. Yeah, we have some really good questions from the midshipmen. The first is from Carson Hillier, and he asks about situations where you're gathering information from groups that don't have the same standards as we do. And he asks, how do you fight the urge to cut those corners, given the high stakes of the mission?
Yeah, well, you don't, right? You don't. You simply don't. And look, there were the second half of my career was dominated with terrorism and counterterrorism. I'd say 6 out of 8, every 16 hours a day that I worked was probably counterterrorism. It was the plurality of what I did with my time. And it's very easy to think that they should be treated in a different way than, say, people who work for a nation state. But you have to fight that urge, right? I'll give you 2 examples. People often ask me the mood in the room when bin Laden was killed. And what I tell them, which is the truth, is that it was not like a locker room. There wasn't a lot of cheering and high-fiving and anything like that. Why? Because we just had killed several human beings, terrorists for sure, but several human beings. We had killed a couple of civilians. We killed one of the wives, and we had scared the wits out of a whole bunch of children. I mean, it's hard to overstate how hysterical these kids were who lived in that compound, right? And when you think about that, right, all of a sudden, it takes away the urge to have that locker room atmosphere.
Right.
I think the other thing I'd say is that, sometimes operations would end in my office, either as deputy director or acting director, where somebody would come in my office and say, hey, we'd like to do this. We need your approval. And it just didn't feel right to me from a moral perspective. And I would say, no, I don't like this. Find another way, right? I know you guys are good enough to find another way. And oftentimes in counterterrorism, it was who we were willing to use as assets to get close to them. And we actually made some mistakes in that regard. I wish I could talk about them, but we made some mistakes in that regard, Leon and I. By the way, when folks would come in my office and run an operation by me, kind of the ethical test that I would give it was, if this became public, right, would I be proud? Would I be proud that my agency did this? Or would I, not be proud? Would I want to hide, right? And that was kind of my moral compass that I operated by. Was taking my internal moral compass and applying it to the situation at hand. And a lot of those were on counterterrorism. And I think there was a sense below me that maybe we can cut some corners, but I think it's extraordinarily important not to, because you start cutting corners in one place, you're not going to stop.
So in those types of situations, and this involves a question from Midshipman John Copley, where a policymaker, for example, might be asking you to cut corners and do something unlawful or unethical or both. How are CAA officers instructed to deal with those situations?
Yeah. So unlawful is different than unethical, right? So unlawful, right? If somebody asks you to do something unlawful, you say no. If you're aware of something unlawful being done, your responsibility is to go to the FBI or the Department of Justice. I'm not joking. If it's unethical, right, then we're back to the John Brennan situation, right, where your responsibility is to speak up. But when it comes to, say, covert action, right, it's the president's call again, right? So the president can say, thanks for your view, but I want you to do this. I don't think it's unethical.
It looks like
There you go. Yep.
You froze for a second, but you're back.
Yeah, what was the last thing you heard?
The president says, I don't think it's unethical.
Yeah, so if the president says, thanks for your input, I don't think it's unethical, go ahead. Then you have to make a decision about whether you want to continue to work there, whether you're the director or anybody else.
Okay, thank you. A question from Midshipman Ibrahim, and it involves the effect of eliminating the enhanced interrogation techniques program. And his basic question is, do you believe that the new policies regarding ethical and moral limits on decisions made on the various levels of intelligence collections are a direct result of these changes? And I think you addressed that somewhat before about the effect of this program and on the overall the moral climate at the CIA.
Yeah. So I think at the end of the day, one of the consequences of enhanced interrogation techniques was that it gave the CIA, remember I talked earlier about the CIA needs to stand up more to policymakers in saying no. I think enhanced interrogation techniques steeled the spine of many CIA officers in saying no. In saying no to a White House that might want to do something that, while lawful, and in this case, it's questionable whether they were actually lawful at the end of the day. So DOJ had its own set of issues with regard to this, right? But I think it steeled the spine. Certainly steeled the spine of me.
Yeah, right. Okay, another question, a good one from Midshipman Waranimi. So you said that part of the ethic of an intelligence analyst is ensuring that policy or political preferences do not impact analysis. If/when the CIA itself is politicized by elected officials, does that make it more difficult for analysts to achieve this impartiality? And if so, what can be done to mitigate this problem?
Yeah, so there's two separate issues. A great question. There's two separate issues, right? One is the policymaker putting pressure on the organization to see something a certain way. So in the Bush administration, this was Scooter Libby putting intense pressure on CIA to come to the judgment that there was a relationship between Iraq and Al-Qaeda when we didn't think there was. And we didn't bend in that case. Right. And you have to stand up to the policymaker and say, no, that's not the way we see it. This is the way we see it, whether you like it or not. The other is when a senior official, policy official, goes out publicly and says, this is what the intelligence community thinks, when it's not what we think, right? That happens. In that case, I think it's the responsibility of the leadership of the IC to go to that person and say, you got this wrong. You did not say this right. That's not what we think. And if it continues, to go to the boss of that person and have a conversation with that boss. So those are the two areas where senior policymakers can get involved in politicization, and the intelligence community has a responsibility to respond in both of them.
Good, thank you. We're getting close to the time you have to leave. Let me pose at least one more question. We might have to stop at that point. And this is from Stephen Woodside, who is a professor up at West Point. What do you think about increased paramilitary operations in the CIA?
Yeah.
Are these operations more morally problematic if not done by conventional military?
Yeah, great question. Okay, so I can't talk about what the CIA does or doesn't do, but I will tell you this. I am an extraordinarily strong believer that our nation's military should do military operations and that CIA should not. And it's not a moral issue for me. It's not a moral issue for me. It's an issue of sucking the resources of CIA away from its fundamental mission of collecting and analyzing intelligence to do something that the military is much better capable of doing. right?
Right.
So when you have these paramilitary programs at CIA, Congress gives you money for them, but they don't give you more people, right? And so it sucks people away from the main mission. It takes your best people because this stuff is interesting and sexy. And it takes the time of the senior leadership because you don't want to get anything wrong because it's so edgy, right? So you're probably all thinking about a program that I'm thinking of, right? I would have moved that from CIA a long, long time ago. So I couldn't agree more with the idea. So I don't think, let me also put it this way, and I'm not admitting anything by saying this. I don't think the nation's civilian intelligence agency should be in the business of killing anybody.
Okay. One more? Do you have time for one more?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, this is a good capstone question. So what are the greatest ethical challenges faced in the intelligence community in the coming decades as our military strategy shifts to a more traditional great power competition with rising adversaries, especially China?
Yeah, so I don't know if this is an ethical issue. It's just the issue. So intelligence faces an existential threat, literally an existential threat, from ubiquitous, persistent surveillance. So the ability to conduct espionage, right? The ability to conduct human operations in a place where there are cameras recording everything 24/7, doing facial recognition, doing biometrics, et cetera, is impossible. And a lot of people don't know this, but a good chunk of our SIGINT is human enabled, right? So we recruit a human asset that gets us into a place to collect signals intelligence. So without this humans, not only is CIA in trouble, but so is NSA. And so, and quite frankly, NSA faces its own problems from 5G and other challenges. So how the intelligence community responds to this technology challenge, right, is going to determine whether they stay relevant or not in the future. And I've told both Evriel and Bill Burns, this is your legacy.
Wow. Okay. Well, we know you have another meeting, Michael. So on behalf of all the attendees, thank you very much for your generosity and
Welcome.
candor, as Mitt mentioned, and insight today. And thanks also to Mitt for his evocative questions. So with this really solid start, we'll continue our inquiry into intelligence ethics tomorrow with Drs. Cecile Farb and Michael Skirker again at noon. So thanks to everyone for attending, and have a great rest of the day.
Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks again, Michael. Bye-bye.